Every year I start with I am changing and then I don't. Why?
It's the belief. If we don't deep down, for whatever reason, maybe we've grown up believing I'm one way, I'm not an exerciser, I'm poor, I don't have a lot of money. But what we want to do is just listen to the science, know that we can change. And that is one of the best motivators, knowing that we have this ability for neuroplasticity, that we can change no matter what our belief system was.
Welcome back to Super Insider, a podcast on all things super and retirement. I'm Anne. It's so great you're here. And today we have a very special guest, Dr Hayley North, a neuroscientist that's going to teach us how to hack our brain so that we stick to our New Year's resolutions and become our super self. Hello, Hayley.
Good morning. Hi.
Good morning. You're looking fresh after the big Christmas break.
Yes. It's always nice to have a little bit of summer.
And I'm really looking forward to hearing what we need to learn so that we keep our New Year's resolutions. But before we do that, listeners and viewers, this is general advice, general information only, and you'll need to make sure whether it's right for you. So, apparently, 92% of us don't keep our New Year's resolutions, and I'm well and truly in that camp. So there's 8% good kids that keep a New Year's resolution, and most of us don't. Why is that, Hayley?
Yeah, it sounds a little bit depressing when you hear it, but it's actually good because we can firstly say, okay, this is not just me, it is normal. What's happening and what can we do about it? And as a scientist, I'm going to share some reasons to do with the brain and some strategies, how we can work with our brain so we actually stick to those resolutions. So one of the main reasons why we don't stick to resolutions, there's quite a few, is our belief that we can or can't do them. So it's to do with this word, it's a fancy word called self-efficacy. It's like self-esteem, but it's really just how much belief we have in our ability to pursue something. So say we set a goal, I'm going to run a marathon or I'm going to change, but deep down we don't necessarily really believe that we can change and can improve, then we're kind of just going to I
can see the Ted Lasso believe sticker for those that know with Ted Lasso and the soccer team, the football team that didn't believe they could ever win, and then he put that big sign up on the wall saying believe. So that is why all these years I've never been able to exercise, because I haven't believed I'm capable of exercising.
Mm-hmm. The best part about this is there's this fundamental principle about how our brain works that kind of pushes all of that disbelief in ourselves aside. So we have a thing called neuroplasticity, which means our brains have this ability to change and improve. And that doesn't just happen when we're kids. Like we all know, kids' brains are so plastic, they're always changing. That does happen throughout our entire lifespan. And there's a lot of myths and a lot of self-belief, when we're getting older, when we're adults and, into aging, that we can't change, we can't improve, we're set, like this is who we are and how we are. But the science doesn't show that at all. The science shows that, we have this capacity for our brain to rewire, and it doesn't happen instantly. It happens automatically. It's not something we have to, put a lot of effort in, but our brains are rewiring every time we put in a little effort and making those goals easier. So if it's something like exercise, you think, I can't exercise, you just start small and your brain will adapt. Your brain will start to go, okay, like this is how I do things, and you'll get better and better as you go, and your muscles will get stronger as well. But, if you find you have that, lack of self-efficacy, that lack of belief, you just need to remember, my brain, that mad scientist on the podcast was saying, like, my brain has the capacity to change, and so do I.
And I'm hearing it's things that you've learned from your childhood as well. I'm now having flashbacks of having to go, when we go to mass, like I'm the eldest of 4 girls, we go to mass and Dad would see people jogging and Dad would go, oh, look at those silly people out exercising, aren't they? Yeah. And I realise now as I'm listening to them, I'm like, okay, right. I've told myself all these years now, but there'll be a bunch of people that have also told themselves that they can't do money. And that's one thing we really want to talk about today, is because with superannuation being such a long-term investment, a lot of people don't have a good association with money because of stuff they've learned or experienced at home and family, so they avoid it. And particularly when you think about retirement, it's such a long way away. So therefore, they just ignore it. And they might say, I'm going to do a budget. I want to put more money into super, or want to pay off my credit card. but then it never happens. So is it the same? It's the same concept again. They believe they just can't do it.
There's a few factors. So that's one of the reasons is that self-belief, but it's also the type of goals that we're setting. Like, are we setting goals that are so ambitious that our brain just goes, that's too hard basket, I'm not going to do it. So an annoying part of our, brain's evolution is that it's built to save energy. And if we are, struggling to try and achieve something, it kind of just says, let's not even waste our time.
Yeah.
But if you break those goals down, like say you're saying your goals, like I want to have all of this money for my retirement, that can be really difficult and quite overwhelming, in the early years. But if you kind of commit to small things over time and, letting the money and the investment work for itself, it's not as difficult. It's saying I'm going to commit a small amount each month, keeping to build that.
So it might be I'm going to pay off my credit card, I'm going to cut up my credit card, I'm going to stick to a budget. These are all what you're saying in terms of breaking it down.
Yeah,
into
just
little
starting
goals?
with one small thing at a time, not saying I've got to get my finances in order. Just say, okay, what's the first step I can do to do that? And, it's different for everybody. But yes, starting with the smallest thing, like how can I manage this one credit card debt? And then once you've done that, move to the next one instead of just putting it all in that one, financial improvement. You need to have really small little goals to work towards because your brain will be motivated to do that if they're small enough and achievable enough.
But why, after all these years, every year I start with I am changing and then I don't? Why?
It's the belief. It's that self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to achieve something. If we don't deep down, for whatever reason, maybe we've grown up believing I'm one way, I'm not an exerciser, I'm poor, I don't have a lot of money. If we have these deep-held beliefs, they can guide our behavior. But what we want to do is just listen to the science, know that we can change. We don't have to be the same our whole lives. And that is one of the best motivators, knowing that we have this ability for neuroplasticity, that we can change no matter what our belief system was. That's going to improve your self-efficacy and your ability to achieve your goals.
So I can hear Frank Sinatra saying, regrets, I have a few, but then again, it's too few to mention. And I'm thinking of the regrets I have. Worked in superannuation a very long time, and yet I regret I was not able to see my future self, particularly in my 20s when I didn't have kids and I was spending a lot of money on clothes and good times out that I wasted a lot of it. And so how do you see your future self? Like what does the brain, do you have any top tips around that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So our brain is quite present focused and it evolved that way because that's what kept us safe when as a human species we were evolving. We needed to be focused on what was happening to us right now. But our society has changed so much that now we really need to think about, 30, 50 years down the track, and we never had to do that as humans evolving. So our brain is not necessarily always going to be doing that, and that's why we, spend big and don't think about our future self. But there's a lot of tricks that we can use to align with how our goals can pan out for the long run. So what we want to be doing is using more of our neural network, so our brain activity, to be thinking about our future self, because sometimes it feels so abstract. It's not very vivid. It doesn't have a clear place in our brain. Our present self has so much brain real estate in there.
And so many needs and wants in the here and now that are urgent.
Exactly. But there's a few things like the front part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, that really is involved in those longer term strategic thinking, planning, making those decisions that go against our natural instincts. So the one best trick to strengthen that frontal cortex and enable us to plan more for the future is meditating. So it's actually really, some people think of it as an airy-fairy topic, like, meditating, like that's not going to help me save. But what you're doing when you're meditating is you're strengthening your prefrontal cortex control over your innate instincts. And that every time you do it, because we have neuroplasticity, you're strengthening your self-control. And that's what we really need, is that self-control, that strategic planning. So even starting off with doing short meditations, you're just bringing your awareness into your, present moment, but also enabling your brain to be in control rather than just letting it be.
I am thinking of, there was an article I saw, I think it was by Nikki Gemmell in The Australian on the weekend, where she spoke about, she said, what's happened to me? I used to be able to read Frankenstein. She was talking about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's book and why she can't concentrate. And before we started recording, we were talking about doom scrolling and how our brains have, just in recent years, because of phones and technology, probably the ability to do that is that much harder. And I did see these couple of people at the beach last week at Stratty, and they were sitting on the beach meditating, and my 2 big German pointers were jumping all over them, and they maintained the meditation calmness. And I was like, oh man, like, how do you get to do that? So what are the small top tips to be one day so good that you can sit on a beach and meditate with big dogs jumping on you and you don't flinch for a second?
Well, the best thing is that we have neuroplasticity. It might be hard in the beginning, but every time you do, sit down for 5 minutes to meditate, you can start off with a guided meditation. Your brain, when it's difficult, your brain's trying to form new pathways in there, and it gets easier and easier every time. You might not see it straight away, but even after 8 weeks, you can see in brain scans that there's changes to connections, there's changes to volume in ththese regions that are important.
You can download a meditation podcast?
Yeah, there's a whole heap of different apps. There's a free one called Insight Timer, and it has just different guided meditations, heaps of different apps that you can use.
So if you do that for a period of time, then you're eventually going to be able to have empathy with your future self and think more strategically about future decisions. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely.
Wow.
So it can improve your self-control, and then you can even, once you start to be comfortable meditating, do a meditation on your future self. So start to really think about your future very vividly. Like, there's a few prompt questions you can ask yourself, like, what will my retirement look like? What do I want to be doing? What friends am I going to have? What might I look like? Really start to paint those vivid images of what that might look like. And it doesn't have to stick with that, but it's really about creating those thoughts and that priority around your future self. So it's a little more vivid than this really abstract concept.
And we had Beck Wilson, who talks about epic retirement, on a previous episode, and she actually said, get rid of the word retirement. It's about the next chapter. And maybe in this meditation, what's the next chapter of my life going to be? What's the chapter of my life when I want to reduce my hours and do more travel? That type of thing. But I just heard you say too, reducing temptation. And I'm like Oscar Wilde's, that quote, the one thing I can't resist is temptation. So talk to me about dopamine and what that is. I must have a truckload of it because I'm constantly like getting tempted with, have a drink, have a piece of cheese, I'll go to Mecca, buy a new lipstick.
Yep, don't worry. All of us are very much driven by, I would call them subconscious brain networks. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in our brain that is just driving our motivation, driving our behavior. And a lot of that is coming from this dopamine network. And dopamine gets a bit of a bad rap as this reward molecule. Like it is, we call it a neurotransmitter, which means it is a little messenger, a chemical messenger in our brain that overall modulates different functions. So it's not just involved with reward. So it is, we'll get a dopamine surge when we buy a new lipstick or, have that delicious meal or do something we find fun. But we'll also get a dopamine surge when we're just thinking about doing those things. It motivates us to go and get that reward. And it has such a huge impact on our behavior. But it's not only the dopamine network that's driving all of those behaviors that, make us very focused on the now. We get a lot more dopamine in our brain when we're focused on present moment rewards and instant gratification, whereas we don't get as much dopamine when we're thinking about the future for so much. But what we also have is that frontal cortex, and that's kind of putting the brakes on the dopamine system. So if we're strengthening that frontal cortex by, practicing self-control, taking that minute to say, just to pause and say, okay, do I really need this? Is this going to benefit my future self? It can put the brakes on that dopamine system. It's really amazing.
But then does the dopamine kick in where you've meditated regularly, therefore you're getting better at the self-control, and then you don't go and buy said indulgent purchase that wasn't required? Do you then get a dopamine hit because you're proud of yourself that you actually, it worked?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the little brain hacks that I do a lot of workshops in the corporate world, and there's so much about this habit formation and, getting these dopamine boosts, even from just ticking off something on your to-do list, just even if it's a mental little congratulations, like, oh, I've just done my 5 minutes, you know, you get a dopamine boost if you reflect on things you've done, you know, and so just taking the moment to say like, oh, you know, I've actually taken a step towards my goal. Take a moment to stop and think about that, because you'll get a dopamine boost just from thinking about the progress that you've made, and that can keep you motivated to stick on the path.
So the 92% of people that are likely to fail on their New Year's resolutions who are listening to this, they're probably listening to this because they want their super, they want their, you know, they want to make the most out of their money. And, you know, again, talking before the episode, we were just reflecting on, out of our 2.4 million members, 1 million of them actually checked their balance and logged in, which they probably had a bit of a dopamine hit from that. Do you think?
Yeah, they were probably, definitely. Whenever you see something that, you know, benefits you or it's somewhat rewarding, you know, you would get a burst of dopamine, which makes you not only feel good, but more motivated to keep with it. So if, you know, you check your balance, say, more often, you might be a little bit more motivated because you're going to have that dopamine more often and even have that goal in your mind around that.
But I'm still confused, and maybe it's just me. And for our listeners and viewers, I apologise if you're not confused, and I'm subjecting you to more questions about
it's confusing. Don't worry.
The dopamine and the relationship between the, you know, was it the frontal?
Yes, the frontal cortex.
And the frontal cortex and the dopamine, and that dopamine is good. It's not the bad rap that people say it is, but then we need to dial up the frontal cortex. I'm confused, like around the balance between those two and. Where you put your energy into in terms of training your brain to stick to your habits and create a better future self.
Definitely. So in terms of the part where it's like, you know, dopamine's not bad, you can use that dopamine circuitry that we all already have to your own benefit. So a lot of us with our New Year's resolutions that we, you know, might not be sticking to, we want to create habits. That's the best way that we can stick with them. If we have that big goal and we're just trying to reach for it, it can be difficult. But if you make a habit out of it, that's what your dopamine network kind of wants. So that is really linked with your habit formation system. And the best way to form a habit is give yourself little rewards along the way to keep that dopamine going. So if you think about the original studies on this habit formation, some people may have heard of Pavlov's dog. And he basically did this experiment where he would ring a bell every time he'd feed the dog. And then after a while, even the bell alone, the dog would be salivating. You know, I don't know why it would salivate for a bell, but it's because it's expecting the food. The dopamine network is just saying, you know, it's rewarding. We've got this amazing thing, even though there's no food there. So it's a really strong network that all animals have, including humans, that we can start to work with. So we can train ourselves like that scientist and, you know, be our own scientist and do our own experiments and say, okay, if I do one step towards this goal, I'll give myself an external reward. And that boosts your dopamine because your dopamine is going to be seeking rewards anyway. You tie that reward with the behavior that you want and you're going to be way more motivated to do it. But it's also about making those behaviors manageable so you can keep repeating them. Nothing too crazy, just starting small, rewarding yourself as you're doing it, and then you have that motivation. So that's more to do with the dopamine, and then the frontal cortex is what we need to have that rational, like, even though I can't be bothered, say, exercising or spending my money on savings instead of a holiday, you know, your frontal cortex is going to be the thing that's telling you this is going to benefit us in the long run. This is good for my long-term planning. This is a good strategy.
This year, and you may not be aware of this, I might be teaching you something on that.
100%.
There's this thing called payday super, which is where superannuation is going to get paid every time you get paid, which is a really big deal. And that starts from in the new financial year. And I'm just thinking out loud for listeners and viewers that if you were thinking about taking control of your super, this year's the year to do it, because your super is going to be paid every time you get paid, which is super cool because it's going to put compounding on steroids.
Amazing.
Now, yes, so it's really exciting. So therefore, if you're a person that's thinking about getting your super like really working for you and you wanted to start a habit, could you put something in your diet. What would you do? What would you do if I present, all right, this is the year I want to get my super under control. I know it's going to be a important year to do it because my super is going to get paid every time I get paid, but I'm not sure how to start the habit. What would you tell me to do?
I guess if that is, a goal of yours, you have a look at what small percentage you can increase that contribution by potentially, and set a goal by the end of the year. And
Person could say, I want to put in $100 every, once every pay.
An extra $100.
An extra $100.
Yeah. And then exactly. So you just start small with a certain amount, maybe a monetary value, a percentage, and then you want to give yourself a little reward.
What reward would you suggest?
So it could be something like, you're going to go say it's a monthly thing. You don't want to be spending too much on your reward, but maybe it's a nice dinner out. You say, if I've been contributing this much for 3 months, I'm going to do this nice dinner. Just reward yourself, something that you can really look forward to. Maybe it is, buying that new pair of shoes that you've been thinking about for so long. And it's like, even though you're spending money, as long as it's a much smaller percentage of what you've been contributing, then you're going to have a net positive, because you're going to be so much more motivated to stick with that, because you're getting external rewards as well that are benefiting you more in the now as well.
Okay, so listeners and viewers, you're listening to this because you do want to take control of your super, and you do want to take control of your super self. So you're going to download the app. You're going to put a reminder in your diary to check it every, when you get paid.
Definitely being conscious of it.
Conscious of it. You're going to think about something that would motivate you. I like the shoe analogy. Or a handbag or a holiday or something that you can schedule in, is what I'm hearing Hayley say. And then you're going to reward yourself once you've done it.
It doesn't even have to be a huge reward. It can even just be like looking at that savings at the end of the year, making sure you're checking in and just going, wow,
you get the dopamine hit.
You get the dopamine hit just from going, wow, I actually have added so much more than I was previously going to do. So, and one of the other things we do, humans are very much social animals. Like, we are very, very wired to thrive in group settings. And if we tell people about our goals, tell your partner, tell your family, tell friends, this is what I'm going to be doing, you're so much more motivated to do it because of that social pressure. We all want to have that social clout, I guess, but it's not just about the bragging rights. It's more about
the accountability,
the support, the accountability. So, telling people, being conscious of it, having those little rewards along the way, all of those things, that can apply to your super, but they can also apply to your other goals as well.
So maybe finding a buddy, someone in your family or friendship who also wants to get their super cranking as well and get their finances cranking, and then you can hold each other to account. That's why I've enlisted my husband to come to Pilates on Saturdays with me, because I can't do it on my own.
Yes.
But it was my turning 50 resolution, and one of my sisters said, Anne, once a week isn't enough. But you said... What did you say to me?
I said, that is perfect.
Hear that, Susanna? She said it's perfect.
Because if we set overly ambitious goals, I'm going to go to Pilates 5 days a week, and you've never done it before, your brain's going to go, oh, that is just too much. Too hard. You just start with a beginner class, do it once a week, and then once you get into that habit, you're feeling good about it, you're getting better at it, you can start adding more classes as you go. And
what did you call it at the start of the episode, where your brain instantly knows it's too hard, so it just gives up?
I think I said too hard basket.
A too hard basket,
it's just, it's just how our brains are wired. It's wired to save energy, and if it's too hard, we're just not going to be motivated to do it.
But how do I know I'm going to stick to it? Help me.
Okay, first step, you need to believe that you can, because now you know the science behind it. Second step, you sign up for one class a week. That's all you need to do just to begin. Just tell yourself, I'm going to do a few classes, and then give yourself a little external reward. So I want you to think right now, what is the reward you're going to give yourself to get that extra dopamine boost after you've done your first 5 classes?
Maybe I'm guessing I'm going to feel a bit more toned if I'm sticking to the Pilates. So I will buy something that makes me feel good about being toned.
Amazing.
Yes?
Perfect.
Excellent.
And you're going to have that in mind.
I'm excited at the prospect of that. I think I just had a dopamine hit.
Yeah. You're starting to think about something you want, and now you have to do the exercise to get there. And it's nothing crazy. It's something that you already said you'd do. You do it once a week. We're not starting too big and over ambitious, and you'll be able to achieve it. And you can apply that thinking to any type of goal that you have.
Okay. Are there any other kind of words of wisdom to listeners and viewers who, you know, having a neuroscientist is a first for Super Insider. So any other sort of really important messages you want to get out around this hacking of our brain so it works for us?
Definitely. I think one of the most important things is looking after our brain health. So if we've got all of this incredible money by the end of our retirement, but we've been chronically stressed throughout our whole career, we haven't prioritized exercising, which is good for our brain health, you know, we're at higher risk for having things like dementia or mental health issues in our retirement. So what you want to be doing is taking care of your brain, because that's the organ that's going to enable you to make the most of your money. It's going to enable you to make the most of your life. So if you're doing little things throughout your whole life that benefit your brain health, it's going to pay off. You know, it's one of the other best investments you can be making.
So I'm guessing the meditation, tick, yes?
Yeah, so that's one of the ones that falls into the category of challenging yourself, keeping your brain active. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's not easy to sit there and focus on a particular thing for, you know, 10, 15 minutes at a time. So that's really strengthening your brain. It might be doing puzzles or solving problems at work. That's the keeping your brain active part. There's also things we can be doing for our brain health, like exercising. You know, we know it's good for our body, we know it's good for our muscles, but it's really good for our brain health as well, because it's our brain's full of tiny little blood vessels, and when we're exercising, we're strengthening them, supplying all of our brain cells, 86 billion of them, with nutrients, and reducing our risk for mental illness and dementia at the same time. So it's an extra little benefit to be doing all these things. Like basically anything that's good for your body is also good for your brain and mental well-being, because the brain's a part of our body. So I think that's an extra takeaway for the listeners.
I actually have one last question. I fibbed. I have one last question.
No
so stress, and you mentioned that around reducing stress. Money does cause stress. Mm-hmm. What would be your words, you know, as a neuroscientist to listeners and viewers around that and how to try and get that under control?
Definitely. So a little bit of stress is okay. You know, that can be totally fine. But if we're noticing we're chronically stressed, so that's feeling stress every day, or we have a high level of stress,
so
and
you're
that
losing
can happen.
Sleep and so forth.
Exactly. That's one of the indicators that we're not switching out of that high stress sympathetic nervous system fight or flight state, is if we're not able to sleep. So that's a little bit of a canary in the coal mine to keep an eye out for. There's other reasons why we might not be sleeping as well, so that's a side note. But if we're chronically stressed, that's where the issues start to occur. Like, it can physically change how our brain works. Our brain goes into survival mode. We can't think as clearly if we're stressed or chronically stressed. We, our brain can start degenerating more. We're at higher risk for mental illnesses like anxiety, depression, all of that. So what we want to be doing is, in terms of if our stress is coming from a financial point, which can make stress chronic, because if it's a financial stress, that's something we feel like we can't necessarily escape from. So taking responsibility, like seeking advice, seeking financial advice, you know, starting to take those small steps to get your finances in order might end up improving your brain health, your mental health, and your well-being as well.
So it goes back to those
all
lessons.
interrelated.
So the one thing I need to do if I want to start this year afresh, whether it's saving more in superannuation so I can dial back my working hours, or be more fit so that when I have finished work, I'm, going to live an awesome retirement. What's the one thing I should do to solve that?
You need to remember the science, remember that your brain has the ability to change, and take one or two small steps, nothing too big, in the right direction. Reward yourself along the way.
Hayley, it's been so great having you on Super Insider. And are you loving the energy of this studio?
Oh my gosh, I could feel like I could do a meditation in here. I know. It's so beautiful and calm.
It is a meditation. It can double as a meditation room if it wants to. But it's been great having you. I've learnt so much. I know our listeners and viewers have. And please tell your family and friends, give us a great rating, and we look forward to you joining us again soon on Super Insider.